5. Behavioural drift, when small deviations become strategic distance. Behavioural drift rarely begins with a dramatic mistake. More often, it begins with a single, almost invisible deviation, a slight delay, a softer phrasing, a different sense of priority, a small shift in tone. Alone, these changes mean very little. But as they accumulate across regions, departments, and cultural boundaries, they begin to carve separate paths within the organization. What starts as a fraction of difference becomes distance. Distance becomes divergence. Divergence becomes risk. And by the time leadership notices the drift, it has already shaped behavior across the organization. Leaders often imagine misalignment as a consequence of faulty communication, unclear instructions, insufficient detail, or inadequate follow-up. But behavioral drift is rarely about misunderstanding. Drift is emotional. It begins the moment a message stops meaning the same thing to everyone who hears it. It is the lived outcome of the interpretive architecture described in earlier chapters, the point at which emotion, culture, tone, urgency, and fear quietly reshape behavior. A global marketing director once described this phenomenon as the organization beginning to walk at slightly different speeds without realizing it. She noticed it during a product launch. Her teams all agreed on the strategy. They repeated it back with confidence. Yet as deadlines approached, the behavior in each region began to vary. One region pressed aggressively toward the timeline, prioritizing visibility. Another moved cautiously, waiting for additional data. A third focused on creative refinement, believing that excellence mattered more than speed. A fourth maintained internal harmony, attempting to align stakeholders before taking bold steps. When she looked at the situation objectively, she realized no one had deviated from the message. They had all followed the same instruction, but each had followed their interpretation of the instruction. Behavior had drifted not because people misunderstood her, but because the message had carried different emotional weight across cultures. This is behavioral drift, small differences in interpretation becoming large differences in action. Most leaders notice drift only after it manifests, when deadlines slip, when customers express inconsistent experiences, when regional strategies begin to fracture, or when internal reports show incompatible priorities. But the true beginning of drift is much quieter. It starts the moment teams begin making reasonable decisions within their own context that gradually pull them away from the shared organizational direction. One of the most revealing examples of early behavioral drift came from a multinational audit team. Their leader delivered a message emphasizing the need for greater attention to detail. It was meant to reinforce thoroughness. But the message landed unevenly. Some auditors became more diligent, others became more hesitant. Some increased documentation, others reduced initiative. Some slowed down to avoid mistakes, others felt pressure and sped up to look aligned. Within 3 weeks, the team had unintentionally stratified into 4 behavioral groups, all responding to the same message, all believing they were doing exactly what their leader intended. The leader was stunned. How could pay close attention produce such a spectrum of responses? The answer, of course, was emotional interpretation. Attention to detail landed very differently across regions. In one it felt like caution, in another like pressure, in another like mistrust, and elsewhere like alignment. Behavior followed emotion, not instruction, because people responded to what the message felt like rather than what it said. Behavioral drift isn't a breakdown, it's the predictable outcome when interpretation goes unexamined. Another executive, this time in a highly regulated industry, described how drift became visible only in customer complaints. Each region believed it was upholding the same standards, but drift had quietly altered their definitions of compliance, quality, and risk. One region had become overly cautious, requiring supervisor approval for decisions that had previously been routine. Another had become more flexible, adjusting certain guidelines to local realities. A third believed leadership's tone signaled trust in autonomy and therefore took initiative that other regions deemed too bold. Each region believed it was correct. And in a sense, they were according to their own internal interpretation of the leadership climate. This divergence of behavior is rarely due to lack of discipline or professionalism. It arises because people behave according to what they believe the message means emotionally, not just cognitively. Drift accelerates when pressure rises, but even in calm environments, the seeds of drift are always present. Tone interpretations vary. Urgency carries different emotional meanings. Silence is read differently. Risk tolerance shifts according to cultural instinct. Each small interpretive difference becomes a behavioral variation. Variations accumulate quietly until the organization behaves like multiple versions of itself. The most fascinating aspect of behavioral drift is that it often begins with good intentions. People drift because they are trying to do the right thing. A team that slows down to protect quality believes it is honoring leadership's expectations. A team that speeds up to signal commitment believes it is doing the same. A team that stays silent during ambiguity believes it is being respectful. A team that raises questions believes it is being responsible. The drift is not in their motivation, the drift is in their interpretation. This makes behavioral drift both more complex and more human than most leadership models acknowledge. Drift is emotional alignment, not procedural misalignment. And once emotion and behavior begin drifting together, logic alone cannot bring them back. This is where leaders often make a critical mistake. When they notice drift, they respond by increasing clarity, more instructions, more detail, more meetings, more precision. But drift cannot be corrected by adding more content. Drift can only be corrected by stabilizing interpretation. You cannot fix behavior without first understanding the emotional logic that produced it. One global leader discovered this after multiple attempts to realign his organization through additional strategy documents. I kept explaining the plan, he said, but every time I repeated it, the interpretations didn't converge, they spread further apart. He eventually realized he had been treating drift as a knowledge gap. It was not. It was an emotional drift brought on by variations in tone, urgency, hierarchy expectations, and regional norms. Leaders regain control not by speaking louder or repeating themselves, but by recognizing that misalignment is not born in behavior. It is born in interpretation. And interpretation is shaped by emotion. Behavioral drift is not an enemy. It is a messenger. It reveals where meaning has fractured. It reveals where tone has landed unevenly, where urgency has become distorted, where silence has been misinterpreted, and where teams are trying to carry out their responsibilities through emotional instinct rather than shared understanding. When leaders begin to see drift as a signal rather than a failure, the organization becomes easier to steer. Drift points to the emotional undercurrents that must be stabilized if the organization is to act as one. In the next chapter, we examine the moment when drift stops being invisible and becomes unavoidable, when pressure forces teams back into their most deeply ingrained cultural instincts. It is here, under pressure, that behavioral drift becomes something more volatile, escalation instability.